Bruce DuMont back on Beyond the Beltway, hour number 2. Thank you very much for joining us. In this hour, we're going to be joined by progressive or liberal attorney Coco Sudek, conservative attorney Judith Sherwin, and the woman in the middle is Jo Jorgensen. She is the Libertarian Party candidate for President of the United States. She is a lecturer from Clemson University, originally from Illinois, Libertyville, I believe. And Jo, let me welcome you to Beyond the Beltway. Nice to have you with us this evening.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much.
I'd like to begin by asking you, and then I want to hear from our liberal and our conservative. How important is it to you, if you were president, how important is it to you right now to end the siege in Seattle?
As a federal official, as president, I would say that's a local issue. One of the big problems we have in our country is the federal government, it gets to where it shouldn't belong. For instance, it gets into education, which should be between parents, teachers, and students. It gets into the police. Again, crime is a local issue. There's no reason for the federal government to get involved. And I'd like to add that without the federal government giving the local police tanks, grenade launchers, extra money for extra equipment, and free training, then we might not have that soldier mentality. Right now, we've got the federal government militarizing local police, and it needs to stop.
Okay, that's your point. Let's go to Judith Sherwin. Judith, how important is what's happening in Seattle, and does it need to be nipped in the bud?
Well, I believe that it is a local issue. It is something that the governor and the mayor of Seattle ought to be taking care of, which they clearly are not doing. So I think I listened earlier today to an interview with Bill Barr. I have to agree with him. The federal government has some responsibilities in terms of protecting citizens when their civil rights are being trampled upon or are not being protected by their local authorities. We saw that kind of action in the 60s when the federal government intervened in the South in order to protect the Black community from the local Southern police. So I think that a failure on the part of the police to act as they're doing, or not even just a failure, many of the police probably want to act, they're being prevented from acting. I believe that the federal government at some point may step in, and I think it would be in order to protect the rights of the people in that
Coco,
area.
I want to hear Coco's response. Coco, is this an important issue that needs resolution?
I mean, it's an issue that needs resolution, but here's the great thing, Bruce, and by the way, thanks for having me back.
Good.
I'm going to agree with the other two conservatives.
Great.
Today. I do think it's a local issue. I don't think the federal government should step in right now. I think it is part of the syndrome that we're seeing right now, and I think that it ought to be resolved at the state and local level.
Next question to you, Jo. If you were president of the United States, would you support a national holiday for Juneteenth?
I would. I believe our country has two Independence Days. The first one, 4th of July, was independence from government, and the second one is independence from some humans from other humans.
Judith Sherwin.
Yeah, I would support making it a national holiday. I really would. I learned myself about the date several years ago from some friends of mine, and I'd never heard of it. I never heard about it in school. And I think if we do make it a national holiday, we should make very clear why the day that slavery finally ended in the United States, being the 19th of June, was because the Southern Confederacy, and at this point I won't get into the partisanship, but the Southern Confederacy kept the information from the slaves. And so when the Union soldiers finally got to Texas,
it was late,
and clear that this was done, that was the end of slavery. So I think it's a very important.
Coco, I want to go to you.
Be learned.
Bruce, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I agree with the other two again.
Oh, no, that's okay.
I think it should be a federal holiday. I think it's an important day. I also think it's really important. I mean, Judy just mentioned something really important, which is, I didn't learn this in school either. I learned it through reading as an adult. That it needs to be part of the curriculum throughout the country.
I think, by the way, I am not opposed to having guests on this program who agree with each other. Okay, we every once in a while. I don't think we have to fabricate heat on this program. And in this particular case, we have some light that's coming up, and so let me move.
May I add a quick
yes,
point?
Joe.
I would like to point out, usually the free market does a much better job than the government. And here's one more instance in which we saw many different private companies have this as a holiday long before the federal government. They did that with gay rights. The Walt Disney Company offered benefits to the spouses of or the partners of gay people in the early 90s, 20 years before the federal government. So once again, the free market does a much better job than government.
And also, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, because in this particular case, we would not be having this discussion, I don't believe, had there not been this horrible police incident in Minnesota. That started this whole discussion, which has now sped up the discussion, which appears to be very bipartisan, not only here tonight but in Congress. That 1 year from now, on the 100th anniversary of at least the situation in Tulsa. We will be celebrating the 100th anniversary of Juneteenth and the importance of it, even though the Emancipation Proclamation was signed 2 years before that, and it was actually delivered there a couple of weeks before the June 19th, but it was on June 19th where they had this horrible situation where law enforcement and vigilantes and Ku Klux Klan and everyone were involved in making life miserable and murdering black citizens, at that particular moment in time. It also just coincidentally, when I heard that date, it reminded me it was June 19th of 1964 where the Civil Rights Bill was passed. That's the date. So there's another reason to look to June 19th as an important issue, and I think it is important. We have our Declaration of Independence from the British, and then we have the Declaration of True Freedom for all Americans that go with the Emancipation Proclamation. So I would think that this is something that's going to sail through, I guess nothing really sails through Congress, but it doesn't seem to have any significant opposition there. I want to go back now to the next big issue, is how do we get to the point where we can address some of the issues, and whether they're systemic or unique to particular police forces, of overreaction. I'm not going to say police brutality. I'm going to say overreaction to police situations. What recommendations do you bring to the table, Joe?
As I mentioned earlier, we need to get the federal government out of it, because what we've done is we've militarized local police departments. And what I want to do as part of my platform is bring our troops home. I don't want to be at war with other countries, and I certainly don't want to be at war with our citizens. I think, once again, the federal government has overstepped its bounds, and it's just caused problems, as it always does.
Okay.
And I would like to add, of course, when Governor Wallace stood there at the steps and prevented blacks
in Alabama,
when of course, if somebody's civil rights are being violated, the federal government needs to step in, but we're nowhere near close. And I would say the government caused this escalation.
When we come back, I want to hear a conservative and a liberal, both attorneys, both officers of the court. I want them to explain the first 2 or 3 steps that they think are very important to lowering tensions between the African American communities, not just the African American communities, but America's police departments. Come on back. Just a clarification, the Greenwood riots back in 1921, just outside of Tulsa, did not take place on June 19th. I stand corrected on it. It was actually May 31st and over to June 1st. But again, just to clarify, it's part of an overall discussion of June 19th. But the June 19th is when the Union soldiers eventually got to Galveston and reported that the Civil War was over, and that Africans or blacks at that time were totally emancipated. Let's go to you, Judith Sherwin. You're our card-carrying conservative tonight. Do you believe that is the likelihood of solving the problem between police departments who were perceived by some as being overbearing or sometimes brutal. Is that an issue that can be resolved? And if so, what type of legislation or leadership is needed to get to that point?
Well, I think before you get to legislation, I think you almost need a public service announcement, and you need it probably for everybody in this country.
Which says?
And the public service announcement would be the talk I had with my own son when he turned 16 and he got a driver's license. Now, my son is white from a middle-class family. He was at the time not a terribly mouthy teenager, but he certainly thought he was one of the hotshots of the world.
They all do.
And I sat down and I explained to him that if you ever get stopped by a policeman, you put your hands on the wheel, you never do anything that he tells you not to do or she tells you not to do. In those days, it was all he's.
Mm-hmm.
And you obey their commands. And if you feel that you have been unfairly dealt with, don't worry about it. We will deal with that in another forum.
Okay, stop for a second. I want to turn to Coco Sudek. And Coco, I want you to respond to the same question I asked Judith, and whether or not you agree with some of the remedy that Judith provided.
I mean, not at all. I think, look at the Philando Castile case in St. Paul. This was a good guy, worked in a school, and he got pulled over, and he told the cops, I have a gun on my possession, and I have a license to carry it, and he wound up dead by the end of that traffic stop. And he did everything that they told him to do. So sometimes, in too many cases, hang on, Judy. Sometimes in too many cases, the police aren't willing to take yes or excuse me for an answer. The thing is, we are Americans. The answer is not we should obey to keep ourselves safe. The answer is the police work for us to protect and serve. We can't have a democracy in which we have to kowtow to keep our
but Coco, let me ask this follow up. If we are explaining, and as you say, the police are not, we shouldn't kowtow to them. But again, isn't part of this discussion, regardless of the races involved, and Joe, I want you to respond to this first. Isn't part of this answer is that government gives sanction to police officers? They represent government. They represent law and order. And if they ask you to do something, do it, because they're officers of the legislature at that point. Joe, do you agree with that?
They are officers of the legislature, but the problem is that we've seen that Blacks are treated completely differently when it comes to pulling people over. And in fact, there was a famous case in South Carolina where a woman was having her washing machine serviced by a Black man who owned his own appliance company. And she was shocked when she found out that he had been stopped something like 6 times over the previous year for basically nothing, not speeding, but because he had a washing machine in the back of his truck, so they thought he was stealing it or something like that. So we've had racism built into the government really since the slaves were freed. A lot of people know the story about Rosa Parks being asked to sit in the back of the bus. What a lot of people don't know is that was a government-run, government-owned bus. So the government has gotten away with discrimination for hundreds of years because they have the power to, whereas private industry couldn't do that.
All right, well, let's go to Judith and then to Coco. Judith, go ahead.
First of all, on the Orlando Castillo case, that case was tried in court, and the testimony that came out in the court was that unfortunately, this gentleman did not do exactly what the police told him to do. They told him not to reach for anything. They told him to be perfectly still. And instead of doing that, he did continue to reach for whatever he was reaching for. And having told them that he had a gun, you had officers standing there who were afraid he was going for a gun. And the jury acquitted the officers for what happened because they believed that they actually were frightened for their lives. Okay. So,
by the way, I'm just going to interject here because I don't want this to be a recitation of every high
Well, but
profile case, but you made your point. I want to go to Coco. Coco was going to respond to a previous question, and then I want to move on to broader discussions that can help resolve some of these future incidents as they come forward. How can we get those who are stopped, and how do we get those who are police officers? How do we get them to react maybe a little bit differently in the future?
Right.
But again, I want to go back to you, Coco.
So let me say a couple of things. First of all, the one problem with the Philando Castile case is that the law, it favors the police and allows them to literally get away with murder. Let's put that aside. I want to tell a really stupid story. I had to go to the one of the police precincts in Chicago for something totally innocent. And I went in, the guy behind the desk was expressly, ridiculously, patently rude because he could be. Now,
Right.
I can only tell that it was irksome. It was so annoying.
I would never argue.
Hang on. The
Absolutely.
reason I tell you this is because it's just my stupid little interaction. We've all had interactions with police officers. Some are good, some are bad. As a white lady, I've had my share that have been just unpleasant for no reason. And the reason I'm saying this is because in a lot of cases, the police have been allowed to adopt an attitude of might makes right, because they've got a gun, they get to act in any way they want. And we are a civilized society, and the police have to be disabused of this idea that we work for them. They work for us. It's their responsibility to keep the peace and to de-escalate situations. And if they are so afraid of everything that happens on the job, they should not have the job.
Does
All right,
this go back? I want to go, Judith. I'm going to go to you in just a moment. Just a second. Just a second, folks.
The entire
Folks,
philosophy.
step back,
policing.
folks. Please step back. Let the moderator come in with a question. Joe, I want to go to you to follow up on what we've discussed. Is part of this problem we're talking about, which Coco just talked about? She talked about a rude officer. I'm sure that many people, I don't want to say most, many people listening or watching the show this evening may have had an unpleasant experience with a police officer. They may have gotten a ticket. Maybe they can't talk them way out of it. They may be white. They may be African American. They may be Chinese. Whatever the case may be. My question to you is: to what extent are the unions? Have they created an attitude amongst police officers that they can have a chip on their shoulder? They don't have to be officer friendly to everyone that walks in, whether it's Coco Sudek or Rufus Brown. They don't have to do it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, of course, I think one of the problems is that they do have qualified immunity, that they are allowed to do basically murder somebody and then hide behind the law because they are police officers. So I stand with Justin Amash and his bill to end that. I would like to say that part of the problem is that there's racism built into the system. So for instance, we talk about unpleasant encounters with police officers. Well, if you're Black, you just have more of them because you're stopped more often. And a lot of these are systemic, again, to the federal government. For instance, let's end the drug laws. Right now, we've got a drug war. I want to call a drug peace. That's very racist. And basically, we're giving longer sentences to Blacks. We've got the drugs that people of color tend to use versus whites. They've got longer sentences built in. And so if we've got this system, it's just going to create problems. So what we need to do is we need to return to a free market where we can voluntarily voluntarily trade with each other and act with each other how we want, as opposed to having a government who is setting down unreasonable laws that create this problem to begin with.
Judith Sherwin.
Yeah. So as an attorney, I have handled a number of cases involving what used to be called police brutality. They've dealt with white officers and black people. They've dealt with Black officers and white people. They've dealt with white officers and white people. The police, I will agree with you, Coco, many of them have a chip on their shoulder. And I don't know that they believe they have this, or they have this chip on their shoulder because of qualified immunity. They don't think they have a right to kill people. I don't think that's anywhere near a reasonable position, but qualified immunity is nothing more than a device in the court where the police are given a little bit of an extra edge because they are our representatives and they are the representatives of the community. They are called officers of the law for a reason. However, there is no question that many cops do have this chip, and it creates a lot of problems with a lot of people and numerous cases all over the place. And I'm still dealing with it because I represent prisoners in pro bono in the district court here in Chicago. This is a systemic problem that could be helped with training, okay?
We got to pause. We got to pause. I want to talk more about training when we come back. We have to. No. We're going to a break. When you hear the music, we're going to a break. You got to sell something. I'm Bruce DuMont. Back shortly from Evanston, Illinois. Bruce DuMont back. Thanks very much for joining us on Beyond the Beltway. And again, a reminder about next week. Next week marks the 40th anniversary of this program when it began way back in 1980. We'll talk a little bit more about it next week, but also I want to just let you know up front, we're doing our regular show next week. It's not going to be, 40 years of highlights or conversations with people that you may not even know or may even have passed away. We're doing a real live show next week, so come back for that. But again, we'll be offering some assessments on the many issues that we have just covered in 40 years on this program. It is American history after 4 decades, and we'll talk about it with all of our guests next week. And since we have talked this evening about race relations is one of the topics I think we probably have spent more time discussing on a national level than any program that's on American radio. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it next week, because it was a problem 40 years ago. It still is a problem now. It's not been resolved, but hopefully we can get to some discussion after we have some light, not just heat, to the discussion, and that is our goal each and every week. Let's let our guests now introduce themselves, and let's begin with Coco Sudek. Coco, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Coco Sudek. I'm a corporate lawyer and an art lawyer, and I help people make things and money.
And you said a couple of weeks ago on this program you didn't like Amy Klobuchar for vice president, and you must be happy that she may have been the last person in Minnesota to realize she was going to be vice president.
Yeah, she would have been a terrible, 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 terrible candidate, but she makes a great senator.
Okay, let's go to Judith Sherwin. Judith, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Judith Sherwin. I'm a lawyer in Chicago. I do a lot of trial work and mostly in the healthcare area. And I also teach at Loyola University in the area of ethics and civil rights.
And Joe Jorgensen, let me introduce you. You are the Libertarian candidate for President of the United States. Tell us a little bit more about your background.
So politically, I was Harry Brown's 1996 VP running mate. So one of the few women who have been on the ballot in all 50 states. And I hope to do it again this time. I teach at Clemson University. I teach psychology. And I would love to respond to Judy's last comment as somebody who teaches psychology.
Go.
Okay, so I am not a lawyer, but I do have a PhD in psychology, so I understand motivation. And I understand that while reward works better than punishment, punishment does work. Now, I'm not suggesting people are becoming cops so they can go out and murder people. What I'm saying is if there's a huge penalty out there, if there's a huge punishment, then people are going to be a little more careful with what they do. And I also want to mention, because I keep hearing people, and I heard somebody tonight say, we need more training. It's somewhat oversimplified to just say one thing like training. You can have a state police academy train everybody in the state, and yet you've got different cultures around the place, you've got different leadership, you've got different teamwork styles, you've got different, again, rewards and punishments for each one. So training is one piece of the puzzle.
It appears, based on what the president had to say this past week, and also what's in the Democrat bill on the House, insofar as police reforms are concerned, one area where they appear to agree, and that is on the issue of some sort of a nationwide clearinghouse or reporting system to sort of better identify potential bad cops. Does everybody think that's a good idea, or are there some impractical aspects of that? Anybody?
I think it's a good idea.
Okay.
I think it's a good idea because I think transparency in government is critical for a democracy.
And the chokehold
For us,
again,
we should
they
know
all
if they got.
go ahead.
We should know about them.
Well, I think we should know about, police who have been adjudicated by their own departments
Right.
acted improperly. That's very important.
Right.
And the transparency, it's one thing to know about it. I think the national database, should there be one, will give police departments an incentive to do something
Right.
about police who are problematic, because there's no question there are some police who are problematic,
Right.
like the guy who didn't talk to you nicely when you walked into the precinct. I mean, but it's not
small.
huge.
Yeah. No.
That's the way many of them behave. Okay.
Yeah. Well, that also, I would think that might not be that is that's a labor relations issue and a supervisory opportunity in that particular. I don't think you're saying, Coco, unless I'm misunderstanding, I don't think you're saying that bad incident that you had of rudeness should go on a police officer's record and he's fired from a job.
Not at all.
Okay.
No, I used it only as an
Yes, I
example
understand.
because my tiny inconsequential interaction with this police officer was, annoying. And, I can't imagine how much worse and how much more maddening it is when things get so much
Right.
more serious and dire. But I do think that there's a cultural problem, not only in the police forces, but also in the country that criminalizes everything and looks to the police to do way too many things and gives them way too much power. And that is in some ways, that's going to have to be a cultural conversation that will be an extension of the conversations that we're having now.
One of the things that has come up in the discussion of defunding police departments has been that there is a mental health expert or that goes out or a social worker that goes out on police calls, or maybe in some cases even replaces a police call because so many of the initial involvement of the police deal with a domestic issue or deal with mental illness. Do you agree with that, Joe? That maybe you need, I don't want to say a special police force, but you need more expertise that can go out on some of these police calls.
I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm running for president and I'm going to leave that up to communities. The people who are in rural Appalachia, for instance, have different needs than those people in downtown New York City. And that's a problem that we've had federal government coming up with a one size fits all laws that everybody's supposed to follow, education, drug laws, policing, and so forth. And so I'm going to leave it up to the police, the communities, the mayor, the taxpayers, the citizens, the city council. Let each community decide something. And only if it gets really bad, such as George Wallace preventing blacks from going to school, does the president need to step in.
Yeah, but didn't you also say in the last segment that you favor legalization of drugs?
Oh, absolutely. And I agree
that
with
is
Coco.
don't you wait just a minute. Don't you wait just a minute. Don't you think if your position is you want all the states to make the decisions, should there be some states that are maybe strict on drugs and others that are not?
I believe
why does the federal government have to
should
come down on that position?
Yeah, I believe that all drugs should be legal at the federal level. If the states want to have their own laws, that's something that I wouldn't interfere with, but people would be able to at least move to different states. But we saw that drug prohibition didn't work. And a lot of people don't realize that we had states and communities who basically had drug prohibition before the federal government and alcohol prohibition. Alcohol prohibition didn't work and drug prohibition isn't working. So that's one of the things I would like to do at a federal level.
Let me just mention, alcohol prohibition worked for the one reason why it was passed, and that is it reduced massive alcoholism as a problem in the United States. Now, there were unintended consequences that came with that, like organized crime and everything else. But the initial proposal, why people wanted a dry country, they wanted to end massive alcoholism, and that part of it worked. Judith Sherwin, you raised your hand. For those listening on radio, people are raising their hands.
Well, I'm hoping that you see it. So, I mean, I think with respect, I understand that you're the libertarian candidate for president, but you can't make all drugs legal on the federal level and say that the federal government is going to take that position federally, and then the states are going to decide whether or not to have laws against drugs. That's kind of backwards. It doesn't work.
Well, let me.
If I can finish, please.
Go ahead.
I didn't say anything about what you had to say about your psychology. Please let me speak about what I have to say about our federal system. That's how it works, okay? So if the state of Illinois decides they want to legalize marijuana, which they just did, and the federal government still has marijuana on the federal schedule, for purposes of the state of Illinois and prosecutions in this state, no one can be prosecuted for using marijuana within the limits of our legalized marijuana in this state, okay? However, something to bear in mind, and maybe it'll segue us into another issue, if you get involved in a federal issue under Title VII with respect to marijuana, an employer could still terminate you if indeed they've discovered that if their policies say no marijuana, and on the federal level, marijuana is still an interdicted drug, you could still be terminated and not be able to use the state of Illinois' legalization of marijuana as a defense. So this is a federal system. It operates on two levels. I'm not saying that that's a good result. Okay. It's a terrible result. It's a very difficult situation for everybody. Okay,
I think you made your point, Judith.
Well, can I respond to that real quick?
In 10 seconds. Go ahead.
Okay. For instance, in South Carolina, we had laws against alcohol being sold on Sunday, but when I lived in Texas, we could buy alcohol on Sundays. That's what I'm saying about states can have their own laws. We can't buy alcohol liquor after 7:00 at night here. Other states you can.
I know.
So
in Illinois, in Chicago, we can't win football games on Sunday. It's where we are. I'm Bruce DuMont, back shortly from Evanston, Illinois. Bruce DuMont back. Thanks very much for our last segment of Beyond the Beltway this week. And again, a reminder, I mentioned this before, if you are a regular listener to this program on radio, I've mentioned to you that if for some reason you ever tune in and the program is not on the radio station, there may be a preemption for a sporting event, if we indeed have sporting events, or sometimes there's a special that's on. If you ever can't find us on your local radio station where you listen to this program, you can find us live on Beyond the Beltway with Bruce DuMont Facebook page, because we're live, carry the audio and video portion of the show. You can also find us on YouTube. And likewise, if you're ever listening to the show or watching the show on YouTube or Facebook Live and something goes wrong and the video signal is not working, it works the other way as well. You can go to beyondthebeltway.com, which is our website. You can find both the audio and video portion of the program there. And again, if you ever need further information on how to find us on the Beyond the Beltway website, you will also see a list of our affiliates. So, for instance, if you ever can't hear the video portion of the program and you want to hear the audio portion, you can go to, let's say, WMAY in Springfield, Illinois, or KLBJ in Austin, Texas. We have a whole about 35 affiliates all over the country. So there's no reason for you to miss the program. Obviously, if you have a computer, you go to beyondthebeltway.com. So that's how you stay in touch with us. Jo Jorgensen is our guest. She is one of our guests, along with Coco Sudek and Judith Sherwin. And Coco, Joe, rather, you are running for president of the United States. Did I hear you correctly that you are going to be on the ballot in all states? And if not, which states are you not likely to be on the ballot in?
We hope to be on the ballot in all 50 states, but of course, Democrats and Republicans do not want people to see all the alternatives. So we are given a Herculean task. What's difficult this time is they tell us you need to collect so many signatures, but then they say because of the coronavirus, you can't go out to festivals, or there are no festivals allowed for us to go collect signatures. So I believe we are now on the ballot in about 43, 44 states. So we do hope to get to all 50.
Now, whenever one discusses either the Green Party or the Libertarian Party or some other third party, they talk about its impact in November because most people are going to be voting for a Republican or a Democrat, and they wonder if by voting for you, they are inadvertently helping elect one of either the Republican or Democratic candidates that they want to avoid, that you become a spoiler. How do you respond to those that view a Libertarian vote as a spoiler vote?
Well, first of all, it's a myth that we take votes from one party or the other. We draw equally from both parties. However, we get most of our votes from people who are either independent or who have never voted. And so we're hoping after, so many people voted for Donald Trump because they wanted an outsider, somebody without 40 years, 50 years of political favors, somebody who was promising small government to reduce the deficit. We're hoping that all those people see that government is only getting bigger, and maybe they'll look for the real small government alternative.
And do you favor mail-in voting?
I want government to be so small that it doesn't matter how the voting gets done. And that's one of the problems we have now. For instance, if you want your child to go to a school with prayer, you got to fight against your neighbor who might not want to have prayer in school. So you have to go to the ballot box to get what you want. I want government so small that you get to keep your money and you get to choose a school, you get to choose the healthcare, you get to choose whatever services you want, your retirement, so that it's not a battle.
Judy, many conservatives and certainly the president thinks that voting by mail is a conspiracy from the left to try to keep him from renomination or reelection. Do you agree with that?
Well, Bruce, having grown up in Chicago, which you have too,
Yeah.
I know the many ways there are that one could steal an election, and voting by mail depends on the system. Strikes me as a dangerous idea for a number of reasons. Now, absentee voting is entirely different than voting by mail. Applying for an absentee ballot because you're sick, you're going to be out of the country, you're in the military, you're out of town, whatever the reason, is a totally legitimate thing, and people do it all the time. And of course, the Democrats are constantly yelling at the president saying, well, you did it in Florida. Yeah, he did. He works in Washington, and he couldn't come running back to Florida for the primary.
So, Coco, I want to get Coco's response. Coco, most of the people promoting this appear to be Democrats. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't think there's any difference between mail-in voting and absentee voting.
Yeah,
just voting at home. There are effective ways of validating the vote. The incidence of voter fraud and voter impersonation is so small that statisticians say it's more likely an American is going to get struck by lightning than they're going to vote. They're going to vote in impersonate another voter or vote twice. The thing is, the more people vote, the less likely it is that a Republican wins. That's just the way it goes.
I don't agree.
Arguments are pretextual. I think
then why would then
every
Coco, you're making
way
my
they
point.
can.
I would really like to finish my point about voter fraud.
There is no voter fraud. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. Study after study, it doesn't exist.
Let me ask one quick question, just Coco, and then we are out of time. Coco, I need a 10-second answer. Would you acknowledge that a lot of Democrats talk about vote harvesting? Would you, if the plan was to eliminate vote harvesting, would you still support the idea of voting by mail?
Ballot harvesting is taking somebody's ballot and lying about it.
Yeah.
Of course, there shouldn't be that.
Okay,
no,
but
lying about somebody else's ballot.
But there is evidence.
You seal the
of
envelope.
that.
You sign it. It's done.
No, you do more than just sign it. You should put it into a U.S. postal mailbox, and if you violate that, you're violating a federal crime. On that note, we are out of time. Joe Jorgensen, thank you very much. Libertarian candidate for President of the United States. Coco Sudek, our liberal of the night. Our conservative has been Judy Sherwin. Thank you all for being with us. Happy Father's Day. Andrew Marshall, thank you for your assistance in the production of this program. I'm Bruce DuMont. Good night from Evanston, Illinois.